your fare, whatever it is," he said to the driver, "if you keep the cab before you in view, and follow it wherever it goes." In a minute more, both vehicles were on their way out of the station. The clerk sat in the sentry box at the gate, taking down the destinations of the cabs as they passed. Midwinter heard the man who was driving him call out, "Hampstead!" as he went by the clerk's window. "Why did you say Hampstead?" he asked, when they had left the station. "Because the man before me said Hampstead, sir," answered the driver. Over and over again, on the wearisome journey to the northwestern suburb, Midwinter asked if the cab was still in sight. Over and over again, the man answered, "Right in front of us." It was between 9 and 10 o'clock when the driver pulled up his horse at last. Midwinter got out, and saw the cab before them waiting at a house door. As soon as he had satisfied himself that the driver was the man whom Mr. Bashwood had hired, he paid the promised reward, and dismissed his own cab. He took a turn backward and forward before the door. The vaguely terrible suspicion which had risen in his mind at the terminus had forced itself by this time into a definite form which was abhorrent to him. Without the shadow of an assignable reason for it, he found himself blindly distrusting his wife's fidelity, and blindly suspecting Mr. Bashwood of serving her in the capacity of go between. In sheer horror of his own morbid fancy, he determined to take down the number of the house, and the name of the street in which it stood, and then, in justice to his wife, to return at once to the address which she had given him as the address at which her mother lived. He had taken out his pocket-book, and was on his way to the corner of the street, when he observed the man who had driven Mr. Bashwood looking at him with an expression of inquisitive surprise. The idea of questioning the cab driver, while he had the opportunity, instantly occurred to him. He took a half-crown from his pocket, and put it into the man's ready hand. "Has the gentleman whom you drove from the station gone into that house?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Did you hear him inquire for anybody when the door was opened?" "He asked for a lady, sir. Mrs. The man hesitated. "It wasn't a common name, sir. I should know it again if I heard it." "Was it Midwinter?" "No, sir." "Armadale?" "That's it, sir. Mrs. Armadale." "Are you sure it was Mrs., and not Mr.?" "I'm as sure as a man can be who hasn't taken any particular notice, sir." The doubt implied in that last answer decided Midwinter to investigate the matter on the spot. He ascended the house steps. As he raised his hand to the bell at the side of the door, the violence of his agitation mastered him physically for the moment. A strange sensation, as of something leaping up from his heart to his brain, turned his head wildly giddy. He held by the house railings and kept his face to the air, and resolutely waited till he was steady again. Then he rang the bell. He tried to ask for Mrs. Armadale, when the maid servant had opened the door, but not even his resolution could force the name to pass his lips. "Is your mistress at home?" he asked. "Yes, sir." The girl showed him into a back parlor, and presented him to a little old lady, with an obliging manner and a bright pair of eyes. "There is some mistake," said Midwinter. "I wish to see—" Once more he tried to utter the name, and once more he failed to force it to his lips. "Mrs. Armadale?" suggested the little old lady with a smile. "Yes." "Show the gentleman upstairs, Jenny." The girl led the way to the drawing-room floor. "Any name, sir?" "No name." Mr. Bashwood had barely completed his report of what had happened at the terminus. Mr. Bashwood's imperious mistress was still sitting speechless under the shock of the discovery that had burst on her, when the door of the room opened, and, without a word of warning to precede him, Midwinter appeared on the threshold. He took one step into the room, and mechanically pushed the door to behind him. He stood in dead silence, and confronted his wife, with a scrutiny that was terrible in its unnatural self possession, and that enveloped her steadily in one comprehensive look from head to foot. In dead silence on her side, she rose from her chair. In dead silence she stood erect on the hearth-rug, and faced her husband in widow's weeds. He took one step nearer to her, and stopped again. He lifted his hand, and pointed with his lean brown finger at her dress. "What does that mean?" he asked, without losing his terrible self-possession, and without moving his outstretched hand. At the sound of his voice, the quick rise and fall of her bosom, which had been the one outward betrayal thus far of the inner agony that tortured her, suddenly stopped. She stood impenetrably silent, breathlessly still, as if his question had struck her dead, and his pointing hand had petrified her. He advanced one step nearer, and reiterated his words in a voice even lower and quieter than the voice in which he had spoken first. One moment more of silence, one moment more of inaction, might have been the salvation of her. But the fatal force of her character triumphed at the crisis of her destiny and his. White and still, and haggard and old, she met the dreadful emergency with a dreadful courage, and spoke the irrevocable words which renounced him to his face. "Mr. Midwinter," she said, in tones unnaturally hard and unnaturally clear, "our acquaintance hardly entitles you to speak to me in that manner." Those were her words. She never lifted her eyes from the ground while she spoke them. When she had done, the last faint vestige of color in her cheeks faded out. There was a pause. Still steadily looking at her, he set himself to fix the language she had used to him in his mind. "She calls me Mr. Midwinter," he said, slowly, in a whisper. "She speaks of our acquaintance." He waited a little, and looked round the room. His wandering eyes encountered Mr. Bashwood for the first time. He saw the steward standing near the fireplace, trembling, and watching him. "I once did you a service," he said, "and you once told me you were not an ungrateful man. Are you grateful enough to answer me if I ask you something?" He waited a little again. Mr. Bashwood still stood trembling at the fireplace, silently watching him. "I see you looking at me," he went on. "Is there some change in me that I am not conscious of myself? Am I seeing things that you don't see? Am I hearing words that you don't hear? Am I looking or speaking like a man out of his senses?" Again he waited, and again the silence was unbroken. His eyes began to glitter, and the savage blood that he had inherited from his mother rose dark and slow in his ashy cheeks. "Is that woman," he asked, "the woman whom you once knew, whose name was Miss Gwilt?" Once more his wife collected her fatal courage. Once more his wife spoke her fatal words. "You compel me to repeat," she said, "that you are presuming on our acquaintance, and that you are forgetting what is due to me." He turned upon her with a savage suddenness which forced a cry of alarm from Mr. Bashwood's lips. "Are you, or are you not, my wife?" he asked, through his set teeth. She raised her eyes to his for the first time. Her lost spirit looked at him, steadily defiant, out of the hell of its own despair. "I am not your wife," she said. He staggered back, with his hands groping for something to hold by, like the hands of a man in the dark. He leaned heavily against the wall of the room, and looked at the woman who had slept on his bosom, and who had denied him to his face.